All right, let's wrap up our discussion of fiscal policy by talking about the public debt, the national debt. The difference between the debt and the deficit is the difference in a given year between what we take in and what we spend, when we spend more than we take in. The public debt is the accumulation of all those deficits in the past. And as of last April, our most current number, it is 15.9 trillion, which is a huge amount of money and kind of alarming. Now, how do we borrow money? How does the U.S. government borrow money? Well, basically, it sells IOUs. And it sells four kinds of IOUs, four kinds of Treasury securities. That's it. Treasury bills, Treasury notes, Treasury bonds, and U.S. savings bonds. These first three are the most important, bills, notes, and bonds. The only way they differ is the length of term. Treasury bills are IOUs that are paid back in 1 to 6 months. If you have $10 million and you're going to buy a super yacht 6 months from now, but you don't want to do anything with the money right now, but you want to earn a little bit of interest, you can buy a Treasury bill. Treasury notes are 2 to 10 years, and Treasury bonds are more than 10 years, usually 10 to 30 years. All three of these, however, can be sold in the bond market. There's a bond market like a stock market, and if you want the money before the government has agreed to pay you back, of course they make regular interest payments, but if you want the principal, the balance back before it's due, you can sell it in the bond market. You cannot sell in the bond market U.S. savings bonds, the fourth kind of security. Probably some of you own U.S. savings bonds. When you were born, maybe your grandmother or uncle bought you a U.S. savings bond. They're non-marketable. You can't sell them in a bond market. But they're a good way to save, and they're very safe. You can buy them at the local bank. And some of them, called TIPS, actually protect against inflation. They may pay, say, 2%. Inflation is 5%, they'll pay 7%. They'll adjust for inflation. So it's not a bad way to save. Four kinds of public debt, four kinds of IOUs. Now, who do we owe all this money to? Conventional wisdom is we owe it to the Chinese, but that's not nearly correct. Here's who we owe it to. And these numbers are a little bit dated, a couple of years, but the percentages are about right. We owe most of that 15 trillion to something called intra-governmental holdings. Almost 47% we owe there. What the crap is that? Well, it is intragovernmental holdings are agencies of the federal government, the biggest example of which is the Federal Reserve Bank. So understand the incredible, momentous impact of what I just said. 47% of the government's debt is owed to itself. So that should be comforting. The debt is not as bad as we thought. 1.9% is owned to individual Americans, like maybe you if you own savings bonds. 13.4% is owed to American financial institutions. That means banks and insurance companies. I'm a bank. You bring me your money. I would like to make some interest by loaning it out. If I can't find a good borrower, I'll just buy a government bond. So 13.4% owned by American banks and insurance companies. State and local governments, 5.3%. Let's say I'm the state of Alabama, and I have a budget surplus one year. Where do I want to save that money for the people of Alabama? Well, the safest thing is U.S. government securities. Now, foreign investors do own over a quarter and growing percent of the debt. That is a bit of a concern, but it's all kind of foreign investors. The biggest foreign investor are the Chinese, but they by no means dominate our total outstanding debt. Most economists believe the primary burden of the debt is the annual interest charges on the bonds. We can just go borrow more money to pay off the ones that we have to pay off the next day. But we are paying regular interest payments, so we don't have to pay back the total debt tomorrow or next year. We can go sell an IOU to somebody else to pay off a current IOU holder. But we do have to pay the security, the interest payments. It's sort of our minimum payment. And that minimum payment is becoming huge. In the 2008 budget, here were the four biggest budget items. You may think it's welfare or, the FBI or something like that. No, these are by far the four biggest items. These items together comprise well over half the budget. Income security, $932 billion, almost $1 trillion. What does that mean? Well, it means Social Security for the most part, mostly pension payments to old folks. Second biggest item, defense and the war on terror. That was broken out in 2008 because we have ongoing huge expenses for our Department of Defense, maintaining a global military presence, but specifically the war on terror, Afghanistan and Iraq, is a significant separate item, $627 billion that year. Third item, Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health care program for old folks. Medicaid is for poor folks. Medicare is by far the biggest part of that. In America, you get your health insurance through your employer. So when you retire, you can't do that anymore. So the government provides a health care plan, almost $600 billion. Finally, that ongoing interest payments on the outstanding debt, $261 billion and growing. It's growing to dominate the budget. That's a concern. Now, that said, there are some false concerns about the public debt, and there are two that are often repeated. Number one, it will bankrupt the country. We're going to bankrupt the country with this debt. The second is it will place a tremendous burden on the grandchildren, whoever the grandchildren are. You hear that, both Democrats and Republicans say that all the time. And both of these are fallacious. First of all, bankruptcy cannot occur. Well, it will not occur for the two reasons. There's no more powerful financial entity in the world than the U.S. government. We can refinance the debt. We can pay off your IOU by selling someone else an IOU. Believe it or not, people are still lining up to buy these IOUs. In a time of crisis, the safest investment you can make is buying a U.S. government bond. We're the only country in the world that can say we've never reneged on a bond. We've never missed a payment. Number two, the government has the power of taxation. We don't want to do it, but our taxes are, believe it or not, very low. We could raise taxes and pay this debt off, though no one wants to. The second concern about the grandchildren is false because the U.S. owes most of the money to itself. Yes, the grandchildren owe the money, but the grandchildren also own the bulk of the IOUs. Now, there are some legitimate concerns about the debt. One is income distribution. We already have a problem in this country with stratification of wealth. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The debt tends to make that worse. Those interest payments are going to people who hold the U.S. government bonds. Poor people don't have savings bonds and U.S. T-bills, Treasury bills. So the rich are getting richer. Number two, incentives. Ultimately, this debt must be paid from tax revenues. And as we talked about in Unit 1, taxes lower incentives to bear risk, to innovate, to invest, to work. Taxes are inefficient. Taxes are bad, okay? Third concern is the foreign-owned debt. True, it's not as much as people think, but this quarter and growing percentage of public debt owned by foreigners enables them to buy some of our stuff, some of our output with money we're giving them. And fourth is the crowding out effect. I mentioned this earlier, the idea of the federal government having such a rapacious need for money. It crowds out all the private borrowers, drives up interest rates, the price of money, which lowers money for investment, meaning a shrinking output capacity for the future.